There is a moment that disconcerts. He just touched you so intensely, his eyes said more than any word. But then, silence. No message later. No prolonged caresses. He turns, silences, and seems to move away, as if the link had been broken suddenly. And you wonder, was it just one more? Did he regret? Or worse, did he never feel anything? It is in this void that the emotional torment of many women is born. But what almost no one tells you is that behind this silence, there is a reason that he himself has no courage to confess, and is all about what Deborah Tannen calls communicative asymmetries in the heart. This kind of silence is not about disinterest. Contrary to what your mind tries to convince you in the hours of anguish, many men are silent because they are overloaded by something they do not know how to name. Deborah Tannen explains that, unlike women, men were conditioned early on processing emotions without verbalizing them, as expressing feelings was a threat to their own masculinity. And the apex of physical intimacy, for many of them, triggers an internal collapse, a confusion of pleasure, vulnerability, and fear. So instead of opening, it closes. Because this silence is not absence, it is armor. But this silence does not go unnoticed. He plays at a point that Deborah Tannen describes as female search for emotional clues in language. While he shuts up, you hear the worst. You fill the silence with judgments, insecurities, and even old pain. And without realizing it, it begins to act on the defensive, just when the moment calls for connection, not removal. The tragedy is that this gulf between what you feel and what it demonstrates is often just an unregistered misunderstanding, a communication noise between two different emotional worlds. Only here is the detail that changes everything. His silence after sex is not about you, it's about him, about the internal conflicts that he cannot express in words because he was never taught to decipher what he feels. Deborah Tannen states that in men's language, silence can be a way of protecting, processing, or even feeling more intensely. But how to understand this if no one has ever taught you how to hear what is not said? That's why you need to see this video to the end, to decipher what is behind the silence that hurts you, but that can hide something much deeper. Perhaps he is protecting himself from the affection he felt for you. Perhaps in that silence, he is dealing with a feeling that caught him off guard. Or perhaps this is just the reflection of what Tannen describes as emotional mismatch between connection and expression. The fact is that this silence no longer needs to be a mystery. It can be understood, resignified, and even transformed if you have the right key to interpret. So stay with me until the end of this video, because understanding a man's silence after sex can be the first step in breaking cycles of doubt, anxiety, and insecurity. And above all, you can return you the power to know that the problem is not always in you, but in what he cannot admit, even to himself. The silence that confuses the feminine heart. Have you already caught yourself staring at the ceiling right after an intimate moment, trying to understand why he said nothing? Why did he simply turn to the side and fell silent? Which for you was a connection, delivery, and perhaps even love. To him, it seems to have been just silence. Deborah Tannen explains that communication between men and women carries a completely different code, and that in this kind of situation, women seek meaning in words, while man often takes refuge in silence to deal with emotional impact. But when this silence happens after sex, the woman feels like she was discarded, and this is where the danger lives. You begin to interpret this silence based on your wounds, not in reality. The problem is that we were educated to believe that his silence means coldness, lack of interest, or even contempt. And when this happens right after sex, the pain is even greater, because this moment for women is usually the height of vulnerability and emotional surrender. Tannen points out that for many women the words are bridge. They are a way of reaffirming the link. For many men, especially those who have not developed emotional intelligence, silence is a shield, a disguise for what they don't know how to deal with. And that generates an emotional abyss that deeply hurts those who wait for a gesture, a sentence, a stay here with me. But this silence, however cruel it seems, is not always what it seems. In many cases, it is just a reflection of the fear he feels as he approaches too much. When physical intimacy activates deep emotions, many men enter a state of emotional shock. They don't know how to open go. They do not know how to continue the bond, because they have been taught that demonstrating emotion is a sign of weakness. Deborah Tannen explains that this male silence is a recurring pattern and can only be decoded by those who understand the logic behind the invisible language of relationships. And the saddest is that this pattern of silence can eventually destroy true connections, because as he soothes what he feels in silence, you distance yourself, hurt, believing it was rejected. The truth is that often he is feeling more than he can express. But for not knowing how to say, he just silences. And you, who expected a word of affection, ends up hurting yourself in silence too. The relationship begins to die there, in that silence not translated. And all this could be avoided if you knew how to communicate, and if you knew how to interpret the signs. This channel was created with a purpose, to help you decipher the male behaviors that hurt and confuse you, bringing clarity where before there was pain and doubt. Subscribe now, because here you will understand what is behind the silences, absences, and attitudes that seem meaningless, but have a deep emotional explanation. You deserve to know the truth before blaming yourself again. What his silence is really hiding. When a man is silent after sex, the emotional impact on women can be devastating, not by the silence itself, but from what she imagines that silence is saying. And that's where the abyss lives. Deborah Tannen shows in their studies on language and gender that while women seek signs of intimacy in words, many men feel safer in their absence. He does not speak because for him, the moment has already been physically delivered. But for you, the emotional only begins after physical delivery. It is in this mismatch that silent wounds are born. He may be feeling much more than you think, but feel insecure, threatened, or even embarrassed by it. Yes, his silence can hide desire, attachment, or even passion. But as he was taught to hide emotions and keep control, the only way he knows to deal with it is to move away. Do not answer, not say. And you, who just wanted "it was special," begins to wonder if it was enough. Deborah Tannen states that women interpret meanings even in what has not been said, and this makes them highly vulnerable when they are facing an emotionally retracted man. Many men associate emotional intimacy with domain loss. Being emotionally touched by a woman can make you confused and even afraid of seeming weak. So he shuts up, not for coldness, but for internal confusion. Deborah Tannen explains that culturally, men learn that talking about feelings is a female territory. And so, even when they are played deeply, they do not verbalize. They retract. And this retraction seems to the woman as a disinterest, as if she had been discarded after giving herself all over. But his silence says more about him than about you. When a man is silent after sex, he is often trying to soothe what he felt and not undoing what you have lived. The problem is that if you don't understand that, it begins to react as if it had been despised. And what was just an emotional break for him becomes the beginning of the departure for you. Deborah Tannen shows that the woman feels an urgent need for verbal connection after moments of intimacy, and that without it, the bond can break inside her, even by his side. Nothing has changed. Have you ever lived this? Have you ever felt this silence as a sharp pain, as if you were alone after a moment it should be of unity? If yes, share with me in the comments. Write, "I already felt this silence," if you know exactly what it is to expect a word and receive only the void. Let's turn this pain into understanding together. When his silence activates his deepest insecurities, the most cruel of his silence is not always what he is trying to hide, but what he activates within you. Because when it silences, you hear echoes every time you were not valued, of all the relationships you gave too much and received little. Deborah Tannen explains that female communication has as one of its pillars the need for emotional reinforcement. And when it does not come, the mind begins to rebuild stories, fears, and trauma of the past. It's not just about that silence. It is about all the silences that have hurt you before. You start passing every detail. Did I say something wrong? Was he only interested at the moment and now will disappear? Did he never really care? And while he is there, quiet, perhaps without even realizing the impact of the absence of words, you have already built a storm within you. Deborah Tannen calls this female interpretative cycle, where communicative emptiness is filled by emotional inferences. Woman becomes a specialist in feeling what the other did not say, and that can be a gift, but also a trap. The most tragic thing is that many women begin to shape themselves so as not to activate this silence again. They talk less, to feel less, to wait less. They create smaller versions of themselves in an attempt not to disturb, not seem needy, not scare man. And then they are no longer who they really are. Deborah Tannen shows that by trying to avoid the malaise of lack of communication, many women sacrifice their authenticity. And this is the highest price to pay, to lose yourself so as not to lose the other. But you don't have to decrease to be loved. His silence cannot be the thermometer of its value. You have the right to want a connection that goes beyond the physical. That includes words, confirmations, real involvement. And if he doesn't know how to offer it, maybe it's you who needs to change. Maybe it's he who still needs to mature emotionally. Deborah Tannen argues that true communication begins when there is room for honest dialogue, not just for silent coexistence. If this silence has hurt you repeatedly, it may be time to redefine what you expect from an intimate bond. Because love is not absence. Love is presence, even in words, in gestures, in the after. And those who can't be emotionally present, even after touching your body, may not deserve to continue touching your heart. The silent price to shut up with him over time. Many women begin to adapt to male silence. They learn not to ask, not to charge, not to be vulnerable, all to avoid that sense of rejection that comes right after a poorly explained emotional emptiness. Deborah Tannen warns that this kind of accommodation leads to what she calls internalized distancing. Women begin to silence their own needs to preserve a bond that is already worn out. She shuts up with him, but suffers twice inside. It is a kind of abandonment that does not shout, but that erodes in silence. You are still there, beside him, but emotionally invisible. And this is devastating. Because while man can take refuge in silence as a strategy of emotional protection, the woman shatters in silence, trying to interpret every gesture, every look, every absence. Deborah Tannen reveals that this dynamic creates an unbalanced game. As he preserves his own emotional identity, it dissolves in doubt. And the worst is that when you finally try to put out what you feel, he may say, "You're exaggerating. It's nothing like that. I'm just tired." And this invalidation makes you doubt your own perception. You wonder, am I too sensitive? Am I charging too much? But deep down, you just wanted a clarity. I just wanted that moment of delivery not to be followed by indifference. I just wanted his presence to be more than physical. It was emotional too. The woman who learns to silence herself to keep a man next door is digging her own emotional prison. Deborah Tannen teaches that communication is the true bond between two souls. And if he is not willing to hear you, welcome you, or even realize you, you may be trying to build a castle on a floor that has never existed. You were not made to live waiting for emotional crumbs. You were made to be heard, felt, understood. If any part of what I said touched you, I want to ask you something. Write in the comments right now the phrase, "I no longer accept this silence," not just as an outburst, but as a pact with herself, an emotional limit, a silent cry that marks the end of doubt and the beginning of its strength. You are not alone, and your silence, from now on, will be choice, never submission again. The answer that comes from the silence you choose. When you understand that his silence no longer has to define his self-esteem, something begins to change, and changes inside you. Because for the first time, you stop running after answers that he will never give you, and start listening. Deborah Tannen teaches that while men were educated to silence emotions, women were taught to fill others' silence, even if it cost their own peace. And it is precisely this pattern that you need to interrupt. The silence that heals the most is not his. And you, when he is born of conscious choice, of not insisting where there is no reciprocity. From the moment you decide not to beg for words, something powerful happens. It begins to feel the absence of your attention. And that's where the emotional game is often reversed. Deborah Tannen states that when a woman is silent with wisdom, not by submission, she creates a kind of presence that man does not consider égoué ignore, because what was before, guaranteed now, becomes scarce, and what is scarce gains value, including emotional. But beware, it is not about making games. It is about recovering your emotional dignity. It is about stopping by crumbs and begins to silently demand the emotional banquet you deserve. Tannen shows us that communication is not only what is said, but also how one silences. The right silence can be more eloquent than 1,000 speeches. When you shut up by decision, not for fear, you send a powerful message. I'm here, but not at any price. And this change begins small. The moment you stop responding immediately, the moment it no longer justifies every feeling he doesn't know how to welcome, in the gesture of choosing your own emotional well-being rather than begging for a connection that only exists when it wants. Deborah Tannen reminds us, men respect more when they realize they are facing a woman who is not afraid to withdraw, to preserve yourself, to prioritize. You no longer need someone who only connects physically but leaves you emotionally. You need someone to stay, even later, that is present, even in silence, but a light, mutual silence that welcomes, and not the one who hurts. You deserve it, and you have the right to seek a love that knows how to remain whole, even in the words not said, the silence that reveals more about you than about him. There comes a point where you stop trying to understand his silence and start hearing your own voice, that voice that was drowned out of nights when you expected a message that never came. In the mornings, he woke up next to a present body, but of an absent soul. Deborah Tannen teaches us that every relationship is a dialogue, and when only one side speaks, or worse, when only one side feels, this is not a relationship. It is a masked, emotional monologue of romance, and you were not made to live on a stage alone, interpreting love to someone who is barely thrilled. The truth that almost no one says is that his silence can continue, but he doesn't have to hurt you anymore. Because now you understand what it means. Now you are aware that this silence has no power to reduce the value of your delivery, that his lack of words does not nullify the depth of what you lived, and especially that the absence of response is not an answer about its value. Deborah Tannen states that emotional meaning is created in exchange, and if this exchange does not exist, it is not love, it is absence. It's hard to realize this, but it is also liberating, because the moment you understand that his silence is his, not yours, you heal. You stop trying to fill holes that were not caused by you. You fail to shape yourself to those who do not know how to appreciate your depth and turns inward. Deborah Tannen teaches that women, when they finally hear themselves, recover a power that no emotionally immature man can withstand, the power of not having to be chosen to feel whole. And perhaps, ironically, when you move away from this cycle, it comes back, with words, promises, and even attempts to reconnect. But you will no longer be in the same place, because now you see clearly. Now his silence does not hold you. He sets you free. And this is the moment when the woman stops running after to make the man realize what she lost, not as revenge, but as a consequence of who learned to honor themselves. Deborah Tannen not only talks about language, she talks about value. And value, my friend, imposes itself in silence. If this video spoke to you, if any word here echoed like a mirror of your soul, then subscribe now on the channel. Here you find the understanding they never gave you, the clarity that no one offered you, and the words you always wanted to hear about yourself. Like this video and share with those who also deserve to break free from this silence that hurts. And now it tells me in the comments, what was the cruel silence you have ever lived? Your outburst may be the scream of liberation from another woman who is too silent. We have reached the end of a journey that, for many women, represents more than a simple video. It represents the beginning of a new consciousness. Throughout this conversation, we plunged into silence that so many men leave after sex, not as a simple gesture away, but as reflection of a culture that taught them to shut up in the face of their own vulnerability. Deborah Tannen has shown us that male silence is not the absence of feeling, it is the absence of preparation to deal with him. And understanding this is the first step in stopping silent, believing that the problem is always in you. You now have a new look, a look that knows how to interpret the non-do, who recognizes the moment when he needs to move away, not for pride, but for self-love. Because when you understand what this silence represents and what it does not represent, you fail to expect external validation to recognize its value. And this is where everything changes. When the woman stops trying to fix what is not hers and begins to take care of her own wounded soul, she becomes unbreakable. It becomes the version of itself that no silence can shut up. The reflection that remains is hard, but necessary. How many times have you diminished to be accepted by someone who didn't even know how to communicate? How many times did you believe the problem was yours? When was it in fact just his lack of emotional maturity? Deborah Tannen warns us, true relationships are not born of fear, doubt, or absence. They flourish in the constant presence, in the said words, in the coherent gestures, and in the silence they welcome, not that it leaves. You deserve it. You can wait for it. What's more, you can require this. If you felt that this message made sense, that touched something inside you, do not keep it just for you. Sharing this content is like lighting a light on the way to another woman who may still be groping in the dark of a relationship that hurts, confuses, and silences. Like, comment, send it to someone. But above all, take this conscience with you. From now on, his silence no longer defines his story, because your voice, your value, and your sensitivity matter. And you will no longer accept less than it deserves. If you got here, congratulations. This shows that you really value yourself and are willing to better understand male behavior so as not to fall into the same emotional traps. I want to invite you to leave a comment by saying, I watched until the end, so I can get to know you better and know who is really committed to strengthening yourself emotionally and building healthier relationships. And of course, check now if you are already subscribed to the channel. If you are not yet, click the subscribe button so as not to lose the next content that will open your eyes even more. If this video helped you, leave your like so that more women also receive this message. And share it with a friend who deserves to break free from relationships that only suck your energy and attention. Most women only realize that they are attached to a destructive emotional cycle when they are already emotionally exhausted. In the first comment set, I left the link to a complete playlist with content that can open your eyes before it happens to you. Watch now. We will meet in the next video.